The chaos, where order meets chaos. The chaos, where order meets chaos.
Hey, welcome to Chaos. Yeah, that's actually the name. I know it sounds a bit intentional, but it fits. You'll see. If you're here listening right now, honestly, thanks, really. This is Chaos, and I'm joined by Ita, and yeah, I didn't sit down one day and say, right, today I'm launching a podcast. It was more like this idea that kept hanging around, popping up in random moments, on walks, in the car, sometimes in the shower, which is always suspicious. And at some point I just thought, okay, fine. Let's stop pretending this isn't a thing. So, a bit of background. Most of my professional life has been spent inside complexity. Projects, people, deadlines, expectations. Things changing while you're still explaining what the original plan even was. And we talk a lot about control. Yeah, we really do. Frameworks, processes, governance. All very comforting words. But what we actually live in, day to day, is chaos. Not the dramatic kind, no fires, no sirens. Just this quiet mess. Ambiguity, partial information. Decisions made with, 70% of the picture. If you're lucky, and somewhere along the way I realize, we don't really talk about that part. So, the chaos comes from there. That space between structure and reality. Between what looks great on a slide and what actually happens on a random Tuesday afternoon. This podcast exists mostly because I wanted a place where things don't have to sound finished. Where I don't need a perfect sentence before opening my mouth. You'll hear pauses, you'll hear repetition. I'll probably start a thought and then go, no, wait, that's not quite it. And that's fine. I'm not here to teach. Definitely not here to preach. I don't have a formula. And if I did, I'd probably question it anyway. What I do have is experience. Across projects, countries, teams. Some good calls. And yeah, some decisions that still make me pause a bit when I think about them. I've worked in environments where decisions had serious impact, and others where the most important thing was just listening properly. And over time, yeah, I stopped caring so much about looking in control and started caring more about actually understanding what was going on. And that's really the point of this. Chaos is a space to think out loud about messy things without pretending they're simple. Leadership, projects, technology, AI, sure, but also doubt, judgment, responsibility, the stuff we usually edit out. Sometimes I'll talk about work, sometimes about decisions that didn't land the way I expected. Sometimes it'll just be me trying to make sense of something that's still unfinished. No scripts, no big conclusions, no this is the answer, just a conversation between me and you. And if there's a goal here, quietly, it's not to remove chaos. It's to sit with it a bit longer, understand it a bit better, and maybe navigate it with a bit more calm. So, yeah. This is Chaos, and this is where it starts. Today, I will speak a bit about a topic that really mattered to me. Sustainability. Not in the woke sense of the word, but on the real neat sense of it. I had the pleasure to meet some brains, experts on the topic, like Joel Carboni, CEO and founder of the Green Project Management. Ian's had the chance to chat with him a bit and listen to some of his talks about the topic. Yeah, so before we go any further, I want to slow this down a bit. Because sustainability is one of those words that shows up everywhere now and somehow still feels misunderstood. We hear it in meetings, in decks, in strategies. And most of the time it sounds important, but also a bit distant, almost abstract. And for a long time, I'll be honest, I treated it like that too. Something relevant, but slightly outside the real work of projects. Until I started listening more carefully to what Joel Carboni was saying, not because he was louder, actually quite the opposite. Joel comes from the world of projects, real ones, with constraints, trade-offs, pressure. And what struck me wasn't a big message about saving the planet. It was something much quieter. The idea that projects shape the future, whether we intend them to or not. Every decision we make, every shortcut, every we'll fix it later, it leaves a trace. And sustainability, in that sense, isn't a nice to have. But it's just the name we give to being honest about impact. That was the shift for me. Not ideology, not compliance, responsibility. And once you see sustainability through that lens, you can't really unsee it, because the question stops being, should we care about sustainability? And quietly becomes, what are we actually creating here? And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. But so once that question is on the table, what are we actually creating here? The conversation changes, because sustainability isn't just about the environment. That's usually where people go first, and I get it. But that's only a piece of it. What Joel Carboni helped me understand is that sustainability is really about systems, about how things behave over time, not just how they look at Go Live. That's where the P5 model comes in. People, planet, prosperity, process, product, and yeah. At first glance, it sounds like another framework, another model to remember. But if you sit with it for a moment, it's actually very practical. People, burnout, safety, motivation, communities affected by our projects. Prosperity. Are we creating real value or just pushing costs into the future? Process and product. What happens after delivery? What kind of maintenance, risk, technical debt are we locking in? Most projects don't fail on day one. They fail quietly, 6 months later, a year later, when nobody's paying attention anymore. And that's the uncomfortable part. A project can be successful, on time, on budget, scope delivered, and still be deeply unsustainable. And once you see that, it starts to challenge how we define success in the first place. And this is exactly where the conversation often goes wrong, because this is usually the point where sustainability splits into two very different parts. And I'm going to say this carefully, because this isn't about mocking anyone. There's a version of sustainability that's performative, polite, comfortable, slides with the right words, ESG labels, checklists that make us feel aligned without really changing anything. That's what people often call woke sustainability. It looks good, it sounds good, and most importantly, it doesn't force hard decisions. Nothing slows down, nothing gets cancelled, nothing uncomfortable needs to be said out loud. But then there's the other kind, the one Joel keeps coming back to. Real sustainability, the kind that actually changes behavior. Because real sustainability creates friction, it forces trade-offs, it asks questions people don't like. Should we really be doing this project at all? Should we be doing it this way? Who carries the cost and when? That's why a line of another brain of our industry, Lloyd Skinner, stuck with me. Not doing bad is not the same as doing good. If sustainability doesn't affect decisions, if it doesn't introduce a bit of discomfort, then it's probably just narrative. And the irony is, real sustainability is quieter. Less slogans, more responsibility. And once you accept that, it stops being an abstract idea and starts landing right on the project manager's desk. Because at that point, you can't really hide behind the plan anymore. This is where sustainability becomes inconvenient, especially for project managers, because suddenly it's not just about delivery, it's not just scope, time, cost, it's impact. And that's uncomfortable. Project managers like to think of themselves as neutral. We execute, we align, we deliver what was agreed. But sustainability doesn't care much about neutrality. Every decision we support, every risk we accept quietly, every shortcut we normalize, that's a choice. And Joel is very clear on this. Projects are not neutral instruments. They shape behaviors, systems, incentives, sometimes long after the project is done. So the PM role shifts, not into activism, that's not the point, but into awareness, asking slightly better questions, flagging consequences earlier, making trade-offs visible instead of burying them, and yes, that adds pressure. Because it's much easier to say, I'm just following the plan, than to say, this plan creates problems later. But silence is also a decision, and once you see that, the role feels heavier, but also more honest. And this brings me to where I've personally landed on all of this. So let me land this from a more personal place. I'm not pretending I have this figured out. I don't. I still work in environments where speed matters, where trade-offs are real, where perfect is not an option. But what changed, mostly thanks to listening to Joel, is the type of questions I ask. I'm less interested in looking sustainable, and more interested in understanding consequences, less focused on ticking boxes, and more on what happens after the project slides disappear. For me, sustainability isn't a badge, it's a lens, a way of slowing down just enough to see what we're actually building, and who pays the price later. And no, this doesn't mean every project becomes slower or heavier. It just means we stop pretending our decisions are harmless, that we accept responsibility not just for delivery, but for impact. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth here. We don't need more sustainability language, we need better judgment. And that's a good place to pause for now. So after talking about sustainability like this, there's a point where it naturally bumps into something else. Sense making. Because the more I think about sustainability today, the more I feel it's both things at the same time. It's the answer. And it's also the question we still haven't solved. We use the word a lot, sometimes too easily, sometimes as a slogan, sometimes to justify choices that are good for us, but not necessarily good for everyone else. And the problem isn't really lack of data anymore, honestly. We already know a lot. There's more data coming, sure. There's always more data, but that's not the core issue. The real issue is what we do with what we already know. Or worse, how conveniently we choose to interpret it, and that's where this sentence keeps coming back to me. The problem is not that we don't know, it's that when we do know, we don't always make the effort to improve. We select, we filter, we shape the story in a way that feels comfortable, and sustainability without proper sense-making becomes exactly that. A story, not a responsibility. So for me, this is where the bridge is. Sustainability needs sense-making because data alone doesn't change behavior. Numbers don't take responsibility. Dashboards don't feel consequences. Humans do. And that's probably the right moment to talk about what sense-making actually means to me. When I hear sense-making, the first thing that comes to mind is instinct, not gut feeling in a reckless way, but that very human ability to make decisions when the full picture simply doesn't exist. That, for me, is still the biggest difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. We can decide in the unknown, we can read weak signals, we can connect things that don't yet form a pattern, we can stop and ask, what am I not seeing here? And this matters a lot in leadership and in projects, because what I see too often is people looking only at their own feet, their task, their KPI, their deadline. Very little awareness of the wider system they're operating in. That's where sense-making breaks down. Not because people don't care, but because they don't lift their eyes. And yes, we're drowning in information. Meetings, reports, dashboards, tools, more than ever. And that's where AI comes in. AI can help. It really can. It gives us more information, sometimes faster, sometimes clearer, but without human judgment, it also creates noise. Because more information doesn't automatically mean better decisions. Sense-making is the filter, it's the pause before the click, the moment where you step back and try to understand what really matters. And I've seen this many times, situations where all the data was there, but the decision still went wrong. Not because we lacked information, but because we interpreted it in the way that suited us best at the time. And that's why this matters more than it sounds. Not a responsibility. So for me, this is where the bridge is. Sustainability needs sense-making because data alone doesn't change behavior. Numbers don't take responsibility. Dashboards don't feel consequences. Humans do. And that's probably the right moment to talk about what sense-making actually means to me. So to close this, and yeah, I want to close it gently. This first episode wasn't meant to give answers. If anything, it was meant to open a bit of space between sustainability and sense-making, between data and judgment, between knowing and actually doing better. For me, they're deeply connected. Sustainability without sense-making becomes noise. Sense-making without responsibility becomes clever excuses. And somewhere in the middle is where the real work is. I don't expect anyone to walk away from this reasoning of mine with a checklist or something similar, but hope more curious. That's what I hope. That you walk away a bit more curious, maybe asking slightly different questions, maybe pausing one extra second before a decision that feels too easy. Because the problem isn't that we don't know enough. It's that knowing doesn't automatically mean we choose to improve. So, yeah. If you stayed with me until here, thank you. Honestly, this was the chaos. And if this sparked something, a thought, a doubt, a question you can't quite name yet, then maybe that's a good place to stop. And a good reason to continue. Thanks for listening.
The chaos where order meets chaos. 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 The